DC Comics have crafted a divine cosmology of gods, monsters, heroes, and villains in the most extraordinary work of fiction ever produced. The cosmology is so expansive, it bestows every character with a relatable and somehow incomparable orientation. For nearly 100 years, DC has been a household name because even their strangest or most obscure character can change the way that you see the world. And that's all well and good, but we know what you're thinking. Who reads comics? Lots of people. Because when you think about it, along with jazz, rap, blues, and video games, comic books are among the quintessential American art forms. But for various reasons, comics are still considered to be the lesser art. But now that comic book movies and television shows are hotter than ever, it's safe to say people want to start reading comics. But with thousands of different characters, tens of thousands of series, and millions of issues, no one knows where to start. And that's a real problem, because if you like any of the Marvel movies, you will love Marvel Comics. DC films, on the other hand, it's complicated. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, DC Comics can be really confusing. We humbly offer a different approach to this particular dilemma. By viewing DC's entire body of work as a cosmology, chronologically understanding the company's real-world history, we can understand their fictional universes all the easier. The lesser-known comic book creators injected their art with topical and socially relevant themes that created icons that are certainly complicated by real-world events. But from those complications sprang a line of comics rich with legacy, complex stories, and beloved characters that are the very foundation of the cosmology. First, though, we should brush up on some general comic book history. Ages of comic books are the comic book equivalents to historical periods like the Renaissance or the Industrial Revolution. The most commonly agreed upon ages of comics are the Platinum, Golden, Silver, Bronze, and Modern ages. The ages are usually defined by their new characters, art styles, themes, and overall impact on pop culture. After we brush up on the creators, characters, and ages, we will examine every fictional crisis. For the most part, a crisis reinterprets the cosmology by alternating history, introducing new concepts, reflecting upon the state of the comic book industry, and if everything goes just right, tell an epically crafted story. The core crises have deconstructed and reconstructed the entire cosmology of DC Comics, where heroes from all walks of life must coalesce as the single best hope against a guaranteed existential crisis. But before we can touch any of that, we should probably discuss the dramatic and little-known origin of DC Comics. Hello, I'm the world's finest BJ. Welcome to the Comics Quest, and thank you for joining us as we decrypt the cosmology of DC Comics.
Thanks for sticking with us this far. You can call me Action Jackson. And to pick up where BJ left off, DC is directly responsible for what is referred to as the Golden Age of comics. But as cool as that sounds, no one knows what that means. Broadly speaking, the Golden Age of comics saw the creation of the modern serialized comic, and many of the most iconic characters of the 20th century. The Golden Age began in 1938, lasting until about 1956. Listen, there's been a lot of he said, she said type hearsay in the history of this company, so be sure to find those juicy details in Paul Levitt's The Golden Age of DC Comics, or Jared Jones' Men of Tomorrow. In 1934, Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson started the publishing line National Allied Publications. Then, in 1935, New Fun, the big comic magazine, debuted. This was the very first time a comic book was its own original story, as opposed to reprinted comic strips collected from newspapers. Nicholson secured a group of ambitious young artists, writers, and financial backers that would eventually produce the ongoing titles Detective Comics, and Adventure Comics. These titles were anthologies and short stories, and lacked the mainstream characters you might expect. Notably, both titles abandoned the single-page story approach in favor of longer, single-theme stories that were both fun and digestible. And yes, Detective Comics is where DC Comics would eventually get their name. Anyways, just a few years after its inception, Nicholson went into debt from a lawsuit struck by his distributing partner and co-owner, Harry Donenfeld. Nicholson was by many accounts a boozer, and the mismanagement of his company prompted Harry Donenfeld to take control of Nicholson's business assets. Subsequently, Nicholson lost his stakes in National Allied Publications and the smaller sister company, Detective Comics Inc.
Following Nicholson's ousting from the company, Donenfeld placed the majority of his confidence in his accountant, Jack Leibowitz. Leibowitz's task? Save the companies from financial ruin.
The United States was in a unique position by the end of the 30s. It was a time of significant change following industrialization across the country. While industrialization prompted innovation, it also came with poverty, labor abuse, political corruption, and the rise of radical ideologies. Fascism was on the rise in Europe. The United States had faced an unprecedented economic crisis, and street crime was a rampant public fear. Leibowitz took a leap of faith in two aspiring creatives, writer Jerry Siegel and artist Joe Shuster. Their early work centered around Dr. Occult, a for the time conventional supernatural detective. After years of refining and attempting to sell their new character, and years of rejection,
nobody liked it. This was an anomaly. Nobody else was doing it. Everybody was doing cowboys, detective, science fiction type things. These two 17-year-old Jewish kids in Cleveland, Ohio, created a genre.
Leibowitz approved their pitch, the Man of Tomorrow, the Superman. For just $130 in Great Depression money, the pair created a hero who could combat issues too significant for an ordinary man to handle. In 1938, National Allied Publications published Action Comics #1, wherein Superman began his everlasting quest for truth and justice. Clark Kent, Kal-El, Superman had the honor of officially kicking off the golden age of comic books.
Superman comes from this other place to America. He can never go back there. It's been destroyed, very much as the Europe that especially the European Jews left behind was eventually destroyed. He leaves behind the vaguely Hebraic-sounding Kal-El and becomes Clark Kent, the ultimate American.
Superman was about the immigrant experience in a very, very powerful way. It's the kid from the old country who brings the best values from the old country, in this case the old planet, to America, adds it to the pot, and accepts the best part of America. It's a really powerful set of ideas that was really important to people in the 30s and 40s.
Notably, Detective Comics was at the same time a comic book title and the sister company of National Allied Publications.
Detective Comics Inc. was initially led by Nicholson, but once he fell off the wagon, Donenfeld made an editorial mandate that shifted DC Inc. even further away from its anthology take on storytelling.
Now, their stories would follow a more serialized format, starring a single character that could share the success that Superman found in Action Comics. The next year, billionaire orphan philanthropist Bruce Wayne donned a cape and cowl to combat street-level crimes as the Batman in Detective Comics #27, created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger.
Unlike Superman, he had no superpowers, and there were other differences. While Superman fought for a liberal social agenda, the Batman fought crime, plain and simple.
The two characters combated street violence, corruption, and other dastardly wrongdoers, ushering in the dawn of the superhero.
The Batman succeeds to this day because children secretly hope their parents get gunned down.
But really, with little to no exaggeration, superheroes would not exist without Superman or Batman, simply because they resonated with the public.
There was no social media, diseases swept the streets, good luck getting into a movie theater, no one had TVs, and radios were still relatively expensive. But comics, a stack of comics, would only cost $1. And in an era where many people worried about when their next meal would come, entertainment was usually worth every penny. And just like that, the medium of comic books exploded.
Kids began reading comics as soon as they could read. It was the first purchase you made yourself.
While all of that's happening, Max Gaines forms All American Publications with the financial backing of Harry Donenfeld.
Max Gaines, despite having a superhero name, was an asshole. But his contributions to the industry are undeniable. All American Publications debuted the train conductor engineer Alan Scott as the original Magical Green Lantern.
He had a mask, blonde hair, an emblem on his chest, and a ring on his finger. I never remember which finger.
The modern-day Mercury, Jay Garrick, best known as The Flash, and everyone's favorite, Hawkman?
With Gaines' leadership, Donenfeld's money, and Gardner Fox's prolific talent to think, in 1940, All-American had a brilliant idea. What if there was a single title where you could find not one or two superpowered characters, but a whole team of superpowered heroes? All-American Publications holds the enviable esteem of having formed the first true super team, the Justice Society of America.
A series of convoluted and dramatic lawsuits that we are going to sidestep for the sake of time ultimately resulted with All-American Publications and their intellectual properties merging with National Allied Publications and DC Inc. In a few short years, the companies had collectively created The Flash, Green Lantern, Aquaman, Robin, the Spectre, Lex Luthor, Hawkman, Joker, Green Arrow, Black Canary, and the quintessential Wonder Woman. In essence, many of the most iconic comic book characters of all time.
In short, the company we know as DC Comics started out selling bootleg porno magazines.
Some people did jail time for these magazines in the 30s, so they were pornography by the standards of the 30s. Harry Donenfeld almost went to jail. He had to talk one of his employees into taking the rap for him in exchange for a job for life.
But when the feds came a-knockin', they incorporated as National Allied Publications. Eventually, National Allied and its subsidiary, Detective Comics Inc., merged with All-American Publications, creating National Comics Publications. Then, basically out of spite, the company was renamed to National Periodical Publications in 1961. Finally, Warner Brothers bought them in 1969, and they have been DC Comics ever since.
The early years of DC were a runaway success, although exact sales numbers from this period have been lost to the sands of time.
Still, we can say without question, sales figures from the period have never been surpassed. Best estimates place somewhere between 15 to 25 million comics printed each month for the duration of the war.
Many DC comic books wound up in the hands of Allied troops during World War II. Comic books taught soldiers how to read, a real problem for American troops, offering instructions, training, leisure, and served up a healthy amount of patriotic jingoism.
In fact, there was a Pentagon study where they were anxious to find out what was the best way of conveying information in a form that it would be understood and, importantly, that it would be retained. It turned out that of all of those methods of conveying information to soldiers, the one that they would retain and remember, that was comics.
The war effort also explains many of the distasteful, let's rephrase that, openly racist depictions of Axis forces.
The superheroes went off to war with great gusto. Week after week, month after month, just pounding the hell out of the Nazis.
The stories had so much pro-American propaganda that you'd almost think they were subsidized by the government, but it was just, we felt we had to do that.
The war left a permanent mark on the industry, contextualizing why so many DC characters have been intrinsically tied to the conflict, even 7 decades after.
Many of the brightest talents in comics join their superheroes in the fight. Many enlist, not all of them come back.
And there's probably something to say about a fascist power being toppled by other superpowered entities with their own fascist undertones.
The idea that you can solve problems through physical strength, by being stronger and more dominating, more powerful, that is fascism.
But there is probably more to say about superheroes' popularity during a time when America walked away from a world war with a clean W and an improved, if not obviously flawed, self-image.
We all were kids from the Bronx. We were all a bunch of schmucks, talking Jewish. Schmucks. We were innocent, talented, guys. Who schmucks?
Either way, characters like Batman and Superman were selling around 1 million copies per issue per month for years.
Comic book sales soared from 15 million a month in 1942 to 25 million a month a year later. World War II was the peak of what would be called the golden age of comics.
The success that DC had stumbled upon, of course, invited other publishers to throw their hat into the superhero ring.
Comic books found popularity among servicemen entering World War II, but we cannot reiterate enough how big of a deal Superman was.
Everywhere you go, Superman. He's in your newspaper strip. He's on your radio. There's short cartoons in your theater. He's on clothing.
By the 1940s, Supermania was in full swing, and comic books and superheroes were the zeitgeist of cultural appeal.
The Adventures of Superman radio show is broadcast into living rooms across America. Every week promises a new thrilling adventure. In all, more than 2,000 episodes air.
With a global conflict, it was apparent the world needed a real Superman.
So logically, every comic book publisher wanted that sweet, sweet superhero formula DC had seemingly perfected with Superman.
DC was the biggest comic book publisher, but there were more than a dozen competitors. One was Timely Comics, which would one day be known as Marvel.
Although many tried, it was rival publisher Fawcett Comics that eventually cracked the Superman formula.
Late in 1939, someone at Fawcett Comics caught wind that DC's next big thing would be called The Flash. In a dash to beat DC to the punch, Fawcett enlisted its top talent to create a character strong enough to steal some of DC's thunder. Fittingly, this character would be called Captain Thunder.
Fawcett used a bare-bones script to secure the intellectual rights of Captain Thunder, who was set to debut in Flash Comics of January 1940.
But that same month, DC introduced Jay Garrick, The Flash, starring in his own series, Flash Comics, featuring The Flash.
Ultimately, Fawcett released Thrill Comics #1 featuring Captain Thunder.
Following the success of DC's Flash, Fawcett saw no other option but to rename their character and comic book series. They feared their Thrill Comics would incite a lawsuit or lead the public to believe that what they had created was just a knockoff, which, you know.
Anyway, Fawcett's Thrill Comics was retitled to Whiz Comics at issue #2 in February of 1940. Captain Thunder became Captain Marvelous, who became Captain Marvel, no, not that one, and eventually became Shazam.
The superhero who was a kid in real life. Fawcett Publications' Captain Marvel. Created in 1940 by writer Bill Parker and artist C.C. Beck, DC Comics felt that Captain Marvel's form, a black-haired flying strong man with a cape, was a little too close to their man.
Competition proved DC is mortal. For years, Fawcett Comics' Captain Marvel would outsell even Superman. Seemingly small or petty lawsuits would spring up, but that does not mean they wouldn't leave an incalculable impact on the DC cosmology. DC started to sue competitors who infringed upon their intellectual property or buy the competition outright.
Like when DC purchased Quality Comics in 1955, giving them the rights to characters like the Blackhawks and Plastic Man.
In the case of Fawcett Comics, DC did both, eventually securing the rights to the character in the 70s. These business and legal decisions are hard to decipher even today, but the lesson learned from the Golden Age is people will go where the best stories are told. A quick note on canon for those who are uninitiated. Canon is best described as what can and cannot happen, who the characters are, and what rules the characters should follow.
Canon has its roots in the Bible, but the term is tied to the Greek word for rule or measuring stick.
Canon is essentially just the set of rules we are asked to accept when looking at any form of media. Continuity is better understood as when events chronologically impact the canon.
The easiest example might be Star Wars. Currently, the widely accepted Star Wars canon is the original trilogy, the prequels, the sequel trilogy, the spin-off films, and the spin-off TV shows. If canon is what actually happened, then continuity would be the timeline of events, which, for Star Wars' sake, would be watching the movies in their numerical order and spin-offs interspersed, rather than in the order they were released. And yes, that counts Rise of Skywalker. I'm sorry.
DC's Golden Age has its own distinct canon, as opposed to following comic book ages. That said, it's difficult to discern the overall continuity of how and when most Golden Age stories took place. To be fair, creators at the time were spearheading an entirely new form of art.
So even though there were 3-part stories and team-ups, there was hardly a coherent, linear, or logical way to read these stories, aside from their numbering.
Editorial vision was substituted for an editorial mandate to release as many comics as possible for Allied powers during World War II.
Millions are shipped overseas to boost morale. Over 30% of all printed materials shipped to military bases are comic books.
Early comic book creators were not necessarily concerned with stories that took place before or after their own, many often neglecting to tie up loose ends, instead trying to tell their best story. For a general example, even though Batman was created by Bill Finger and Bob Kane in 1939, by the end of the Golden Age in 1956, at least 10 other individuals had worked on the character.
Finger and Kane are responsible for creating the cornerstones of the Batman mythos, like its supporting characters, villains, and locations. But the creators who followed were not held responsible for holding to what their predecessors set in place.
Golden Age comics feature archetypical heroes in fun, pulpy stories, but often lack continuous storylines, so character progression isn't really a thing.
In part explaining why comics were written off as kids' stuff, despite their widespread popularity.
On top of that, a growing conservative movement would propagate the belief that DC Comics was directly responsible for challenging the status quo of American society.
The Better America Forum brings to your attention the monumental problem confronting your children today. The ever-growing threat and menace of the cheap pulps found in all newsstands masquerading under the titles of comic books.
The war was over, and so came the end of the United States' economic hardship.
Thanks to the New Deal and the Marshall Plan, war-fatigued Americans pivoted their focus on building tomorrow.
But tomorrow brought complicated social problems that could no longer be fought or won through a simple heroic battle. The great irony of the Golden Age is that with the United States' newfound position as a global superpower, American citizens were uninspired by other superpowered parables.
When the war was over, the enemy was beaten. We didn't need superheroes anymore.
The cultural shift of the 50s led to the emergence of different comic genres that were almost surprisingly popular. Horror, noir, teen humor, romance, and westerns were all the rage.
Average monthly sales climbed from 25 million in 1943 to almost 100 million in 1953. But if the industry was doing well, superheroes weren't. Readers were now more interested in other genres.
They quickly eclipsed the superhero genre, and it seemed like superheroes served no purpose within the United States that no longer had a clear enemy.
All-Star Comics, the title that created the superhero team, best reflects this cultural shift. See, at issue 58, All-Star Comics was retitled to All-Star Western.
New issues of Batman and Superman were still selling, sure, but things just weren't the same. In World War II, problems were cut and dry in terms of bad guys versus good guys.
But after the war, political corruption, McCarthyism, racism, and workers' rights were issues that most Americans weren't ready to face. Keep in mind, in the 50s, separate but equal laws were still a thing, and critical comments toward the United States could have you labeled as a communist, potentially thrown in jail, or even exiled. People like Walt Disney, Orson Welles, and Charlie Chaplin were summoned by the United States government to out any known communists.
And apparently, DC was a harbinger of immorality by publishing comics that dealt with political activism, feminism, and equality.
For some, the evil that DC Comics had spread was directly responsible for America's growing rates of juvenile delinquency.
This comic book describes a sexual aberration so shocking that I couldn't mention even the scientific term on television.
Everything changed when in 1950, comics naysayer Frederick Wertham published his opus, The Seduction of the Innocent, in an attempt to defame comics.
He went around from prison to prison interviewing juvenile prisoners, and one of the questions we asked him was, what do you read? Well, he discovered that all of them read comics. Ergo, comics are destroying our society.
Wertham postulated that Superman was a filthy, anti-government communist. And come on, it'd be like 50 years before that was a thing.
He claimed Batman was a homosexual pedophile that took advantage of Robin, never mind the fact that he cherry-picked his evidence. Wertham openly criticized Wonder Woman, positing that her fiery independence made her lesbian, and her BDSM themes were unacceptable for children.
Almost every book was riddled with female domination, bondage, subjugation, punishment, and loads of fetishes.
Although, maybe he was onto something with that last point.
It's hard to convey how often. I mean, I say that and people think, well, like, maybe once an issue somebody started. It's like every page.
Either way, parents literally burned heaps of comics in the streets.
Wertham stirred the moms and the masses alike into actually believing that comic books had turned their children into bisexual, communist hooligans.
I'm not suggesting that comic books instilled violence in the minds of these boys. I've never heard any responsible person suggest that. What I am suggesting is that crime and horror comic books stimulate outbursts of destructive violence that might otherwise have been channeled into much less antisocial activity.
Consider how many superheroes were created by Jewish men, many of whom gave their lives in World War II. Consider that the first appearance for many heroes was battling Nazis. I mean, for the sake of argument, does anyone remember that time Superman single-handedly ended World War II?
Superman's creators Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster thought the Man of Steel could stop the war in 2 pages.
Wertham's criticisms were mostly unfair.
Except for the BDSM thing.
Your Honor, I'm a freak bitch, handcuffs, leashes.
Wertham was correct about the United States' growing rates of juvenile delinquency. However, his figure is directly correlated with the ever-growing United States population at the time, aka the baby boomers. But it was the 1950s, Superman was a godless anti-establishment commie bastard, and there was no time for rational thought.
Believe it or not, Seduction of the Innocent led to actual Senate hearings where comic book creators were forced to defend the medium. Will Gaines, son of Max Gaines, represented EC Comics as the company became the last bastion protecting the medium from societal fears and total censorship.
The attorney presents him with a cover showing a severed head held in a hand.
You think that's in good taste? Yes, sir, I do. For the cover of a horror comic.
The compromise between the publisher and the US government resulted in the creation of the Comic Code Authority in 1954.
Fearing government censorship, most of the major comic book publishers created the Comics Code Authority, a self-censoring organization.
Basically, it meant that comic books were forced to censor themselves, or face governmental regulations.
The comic books were so attacked for the material that they were doing, or if that comic code emblem was not on the book did not get distributed.
Still, the CCA would be a precursor for other self-censoring organizations like the Motion Picture Association of America and the Entertainment Software Rating Board. The censorship resulted in the closure of EC Comics, while DC and the industry were no longer capable of releasing their then best-selling genre comic books like horror and romance titles.
You guys all better eat a dick, cause Sweet D beat the system.
Between 1954 and 1956, comic book sales fell more than 50%. The industry would never again have the number of readers it had just before Dr. Wertham and the Senate hearings.
As you may imagine, many creative individuals would never recover after the near-total collapse of the American comic book industry. Too many of them would face bouts of alcoholism, homelessness, or some other form of personal tragedy. The co-creator of Superman was found homeless. The co-creator of Batman died penniless. and we simply cannot name all of the comic creators out there because their names were never put on their comics. The world is a cruel place, and these people understood that better than most, and they still strove to create an art that spoke for a better tomorrow.
The first generation of comic book creators were incredibly hardworking men. They had all grown up in lower working class environments, practically without exception. The Great Depression had an awful lot to do with the fertility of comics in all of those years. These guys were willing to work incredibly hard to make the stuff real.
Despite some masterful comic books at DC published throughout World War II, no one could have predicted the backlash comics faced in a post-war America.
Wertham's novel sparked the creation of the Comics Code Authority, reflecting the changing cultural atmosphere of the United States, subsequently killing the golden age of comics. Facing near total censorship at best and extinction at worst, DC took a scientific leap of faith, one that reinvigorated the comic book industry and manifest the explosion known as the Silver Age of Comics. Hey everyone, thank you again for giving us a shot here at the Comics Quest. But, just so you know, we have barely scratched the surface on our decryption of the DC Comics cosmology. Next episode, we will be discussing the hotly debated Silver Age of Comics. In the meantime, if you want some Golden Age comic recommendations, I'd recommend checking out Jack Cole's Plastic Man, Jerry Siegel's Spectre, or Gardner Fox's Starman. Those are all pretty good condensed peeks into the wider cosmology during its early years.
But for mainstream characters, if you want to see the Man of Steel's blockbuster debut, check out Action Comics 1 through 56. Most of Batman's iconic mythos was created in Detective Comics 27 through 56. Then again, Detective Comics 168, check that out. But if you want to see where Wonder Woman really came into her own, I'd recommend Wonder Woman number 5.
Having said all that, it doesn't sit quite right with us to just sit here and talk about comics all day without encouraging someone to read something. So if you see yourself desiring a free comic, all you have to do is comment down below. Our favorite question, comment, concern, detail we missed will be talked about next episode, and hey, it's a lot easier than anything I've had to do to get a free comic. So if you liked us, tell your friends. If you don't like us, tell your enemies. It's a win-win for everybody, and we hope to see you soon. Bye, folks.